Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to day 31. Now, today became one of those days where several separate threads all kind of tied together. Some of it was funny, some of it validating, some was technical, and some of it felt like real growth in how I respond to progress itself. This morning began as what I accurately called a waking up morning. My voice was sitting at around an A1. The G1 below it was only at about 50% impulse power. And I was yawning enough to know the system was still arriving, even though I did not actually feel sleepy. So, take 153 reflected that state perfectly. Technically, it felt very good. The energy was connected. It felt right, the mechanics were online, and then I listened to the playback, and I discovered one of those strangely positive problems. The blend was incredible. In fact, it was too incredible. I wasn't lacking confidence. I wasn't trying to hide in the arrangement. The issue was that I blended so fully that I sounded more like one of the other people singing at the same time than the featured lead voice the arrangement actually calls for. This is a wonderfully specific problem to have. I did have one fortuitous mistake on "You won't get a sniff out of me." I clipped the word "won't," said it too loud into the microphone, and the resulting crunchiness of clipping actually improved the growl. So overall, it was a really good take, but clearly a waking up take. The lead energy was just a touch under where it needed to be. Then we did take 154. This brought a stronger internal feeling and one of the great family moments of the journey so far. During the instrumental and backing vocal sections, I will often let a little bit of me out while still staying in character. I'll stretch, I'll shake out my arms, and sometimes I'll dance to the other music in silly ways that helps me stay focused on the piece. And halfway through the song and my dance, I turned around to find my son standing in the doorway. And this was at about 5:30 in the morning. And I looked at him, half awake, half staring at me, and half wishing that he was adopted. While he watched from the chair, I finished my take. I managed to stay composed despite having him come in. And later I figured after the take I'd ask him for notes. And he only had one complaint, but it was blunt and accurate. He said, "You won't get a sniff out of me" was completely wrong. And the playback confirmed he was right about the line reading. I am always messing with it, and that time I just messed with it in the wrong way. Now, even though I thought the take had more lead presence, the overall energy landed almost identically to the previous take. However, there was one more important realization from the playback, and that sort of came from what my son had said, because the realization was more artistic than technical. I change my interpretation to how it feels. I wrote my notes. This is my scar now. It's not Jeff's. It's not Jeremy's. It's mine. My phrasing, my reactions, my instincts. That means they're diverging from imitation and becoming interpretation. And from a theatrical point of view, that's exactly what's supposed to be happening. Then I went on to take 155. This became the engineering lesson of the morning, and at the same time, the comedic ending of my morning. I decided to intentionally test my physical relationship to the microphone, which is a respectable studio concept. I felt that maybe I hadn't been paying attention to that distance. And what I learned instead is that consciously paying attention to one new variable can create chaos somewhere else. I sing in a studio environment with my eyes closed most of the time. At one point, I opened them up and discovered I had physically drifted 8 inches to the left away from the microphone. So I corrected. And in correcting, I forgot I had words to sing. The backing vocals repeated the line I just failed to perform. I think I got maybe a consonant in, and what I did to acknowledge this surprise that I wasn't singing was continue not to sing. Until my brain finally kicked in and said, "Moron, sing." I picked it up, I finished it out. Playback offered only one possible reaction. We're talking a full-on quantum leap style, oh boy. And what followed that deserves its own announcement, which we can only call, "Ladies and gentlemen, Drew has left the building." Don't get me wrong, there were generally strong musical moments. There were also 8 to 10 seconds of gap where the lead singer seems to have wandered off entirely. But maybe the healthiest part of this whole thing was I knew it before I played it back. Directly after a take, I log my immediate reaction. And I don't normally take my direct journal entries and present them in my video journal. I summarize, I check what I want to bring in, but verbatim, what I wrote after that was, wait a second, there it is. "If you were to look at me from the outside, I look my usual self, composed, relaxed, etc. If you were to take a look at what's going on inside, I believe the best description would be ROTFLMAOBBQSOS. Because when things went completely wrong, my first reaction was to laugh, not panic. I didn't get angry. I laughed. But this had value because the microphone test itself was very useful. Getting closer raised my presence in the mix a bit too much, and it reduced some of the blend. So by the end of the morning, the session had delivered 3 separate gifts: a wake-up take, an identity take, and a studio craft take, all wrapped in the fun chaos that somehow continues to move the work forward. Now, before I get into Boulevard, Midday brought an unexpected and meaningful turn in my overall journey. What began as a simple check for messages became the arrival of the full critique from the vocal coach that I had emailed last week. So my emotional lead up to this was, of course, intense. I mean, just seeing it there in the mailbox created genuine fear. It was a reminder of how much outside evaluation can still matter to me. The reality, however, was the exact opposite of the anxious forecast. The response was warm, specific, encouraging. They praised my range, which took me completely off guard, and the bulk of the email was focused on practical, trainable issues related to what I was working on. One was carrying the resonance of humming into the low notes to get a more open sound. One was bringing more speaking quality and stability into the higher ones, So instead of singing my chat, it's to talk my chat. And these two things really opened matters up. The last one was instead of using my shadow, use the syllable why. And yes, I do it like Stewie Griffin. Why with a slightly whiny connection. Why? Because that also pushes it out, up and out. So rather than it being judgmental, the message really gave me a sense of clarity. And my reaction was not discouragement, it was genuine excitement. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised by how directly they honed in on the real issues and provided usable pointers. It also strongly validated much of the internal diagnostic work already happening in these sessions. So I was getting near the right track, and this actually said, yep, that will be the right track, and let me show you how to get down it. Especially around the low note resonance, getting consistency there, finding the connection in the upper sections. I obviously sent a thank you note, and she turned that around almost immediately and warmly inviting future recordings after I had time to work on the suggestions. So what had felt like a one-time risk, it transformed into the opening of an ongoing communication lane with somebody who understands voice coaching, and that was wonderful. Now, some people would think, okay, I've got it, I'll try it, I'll send it back. And I'm like, no. My instinctive response is not to rush another sample. I mean, give it at least a week of honest work so the next recording can reflect progress rather than impatience. One lesson goes, look, I can do a trick. 1 week says, look, it is now in my repertoire that I am using this. So overall, this was more than a message exchange. It was a moment where my terrified judgment turned into future opportunity in this journey as a whole. So the question was, with this new information, was I going to do a take, or was I going to just contemplate the information? And I was sure as hell going to do Boulevard. This became one of the clearest examples to this point of how a small technical adjustment can create outsized results. So before I sang, and with Boulevard, I always do warm-ups because I'm going into a high part of my register. But this time I deliberately adapted the warm-up to include the new exercise that had been suggested in the email, especially at the low-end humming resonance work. And rather than simply humming for pitch, I focused on carrying the vibration forward into the lips and then opening into words while trying to preserve that same resonance. And the immediate response was striking. It felt as though a completely different efficiency pathway had opened up. There was dramatically more sound and power, and they were available at a fraction of the usual effort. You know, I had been doing things like, I walk lonely, and that sounded fine. But then I was sitting there going, and it just popped out like that. This sensation was strong enough to register instantly as big different. This wasn't just louder, it was freer, it was more open. The sound carried itself rather than had any exertion behind it. So take 78, which is my first take as a calibration. But it was not just calibration, it was breakthrough evidence. So the first section was a little unstable in spots, but by the second line, I could hear the new coordination beginning to arrive in real time. So even where it was inconsistent, the improved moments felt like discovering pieces of a treasure map, and I guarantee you I will be searching more for that treasure. There were clear signs something real had changed, and I would be able to find it again. Section 2 continued on that theme, a stronger function. It exposed details that had previously been hidden by the larger technical concerns. There were timing issues, inflection patterns, and even a few melody notes that had quietly drifted into habitual repetition that were wrong. And the improvement had not only added quality, it had removed the veneer that had been covering these subtler issues. And it was at this point I realized I had to do something different with my recordings. Normally, when I bounce a recording, I bounce my vocals and the karaoke track so I can just hear myself in the track. Today I did that, but I also did a bounce of my vocals with the release vocals, not for comparison, not to say what am I doing wrong, so much as to technically find out what have I been missing and habitually getting in the practice of, which notes are maybe flat or maybe off, which entries are coming too late. Nothing technique-wise, all strictly like laying out the sheet music and drawing circles on it. So going back to the playback, sections 3 and 4 showed the trade-off phase of this progress. The upper range material of the chorus carried really noticeably more energy and vocal color, really much closer to where I'm targeting. But the steadiness and balance paid some cost. You fix one thing, you're paying more attention to it, the rest of it can fall off. So the sound was louder without sounding pushier or feeling pushier, and a major distinction suggesting better resonance rather than brute force. Of course, section 4 reflected how excess energy from section 3 drags forward into later phrases. Yet, the most meaningful development may have been my reaction to all of this. Early on in this process, past me might have treated the unevenness as a failure and asked, what did I do wrong? And today that was not my thought at all. I recognized that the rough edges weren't mistakes, they were indicators. Signs of this new level arriving before it's really fully stabilized. Now, because of that, I actually could walk away from a session that was, at core, really uneven, and still feel proud of the work I did, encouraged. Generally, I felt good about myself today. A lot of really great things happened. So the clearest lesson of the day was that future warm-ups obviously should regularly include the new resonance and connection exercises I got today, and not as gimmicks, but as the pathways that really do help put the instrument where it's supposed to be before I even start the takes. So today's progress didn't feel accidental. It felt teachable. Okay, the question I always end with is what I think today was actually about, because there was so much going on. Well, this morning reminded me that growth can be funny. The midday reminded me that fear is really not the greatest prophet. And this afternoon reminded me that good guidance can actually become immediate change. So the whole day, if I try to sum it up into something larger, is that progress is not only about the results being better. It's about interpreting what the results were. Laughing instead of spiraling, or learning instead of fearing. Recognizing things as indicators instead of calling them failure. Sometimes progress is dramatic, and sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's ridiculous, and today it was all three. That's going to wrap me for day 31. Thank you for joining me. I will be back tomorrow at day 32. I'll see you next time, and as always, later.